Ivanka Trump arrived at the event with the kind of confidence that comes from years of navigating rooms filled with power, cameras, and expectation, believing this would be another controlled appearance where polished words and composed posture would be enough to guide the narrative. The venue itself reflected that expectation, a grand, carefully selected hall in Washington, D.C., glowing under warm lights, filled with political insiders, journalists, analysts, donors, and public figures who understood the unspoken rules of decorum and restraint. Outside, the city pulsed with its usual energy, staffers rushing between buildings, security checkpoints humming quietly, conversations about policy and influence drifting through the cold night air. Inside, however, the atmosphere felt suspended, as though everyone sensed that something meaningful might happen, even if no one could articulate exactly what it would be. The event had been promoted as a thoughtful discussion on leadership, responsibility, and honesty in modern America, particularly under the administration of President Donald Trump, and most attendees expected carefully measured exchanges, cautious language, and familiar talking points. Samuel L. Jackson's presence subtly disrupted that expectation before he even spoke. He didn't enter with spectacle or fanfare, nor did he carry himself like a celebrity seeking attention. Instead, he moved with quiet certainty, the kind that doesn't need validation. His reputation preceded him, not just as an actor with an unmistakable voice and commanding screen presence, but as a man known for blunt honesty and an unwillingness to soften his views to make others comfortable. As he made his way through the hall, conversations softened, then paused altogether. People noticed the shift, though many couldn't explain it. Jackson wasn't rushing, wasn't performing, wasn't posturing. He scanned the room deliberately, his gaze steady, observant, and grounded, as though he were measuring the space not by status or influence but by intent. When his eyes settled briefly on Ivanka Trump seated in the front row, something unspoken passed between them, not hostility, not admiration, but awareness. Ivanka sat poised, posture perfect, hands folded neatly, her expression composed and assured. She had mastered this environment. Years of public appearances, interviews, and strategic messaging had taught her how to command attention without appearing aggressive, how to project confidence without seeming confrontational. She was accustomed to steering conversations, shaping narratives, and emerging polished regardless of the questions asked. To her, this was another discussion panel, another opportunity to present her perspective with calm authority. What she did not anticipate was resistance that could not be deflected with charm or precision. When Jackson eventually took the stage, the room fell into an attentive stillness. He began speaking in a measured, deliberate tone, addressing leadership not as an abstract ideal but as a lived responsibility. He spoke about honesty, not as a slogan, but as a discipline, something that demands consistency, accountability, and courage. His words were calm, but they carried weight, and the audience leaned in, sensing an undercurrent beneath the surface. This was not entertainment. This was not performance. It was preparation. Jackson's gaze returned to Ivanka more than once, not aggressively, but intentionally, as if signaling that this conversation would not remain theoretical. The discussion moved forward smoothly at first, touching on familiar territory, values, public service, influence, but tension slowly threaded itself through the room, subtle yet undeniable. When the moment came for Ivanka to speak directly, she leaned forward slightly, her voice controlled, her tone light enough to appear casual yet sharp enough to cut. She suggested that entertainers should remain in their lane, that actors ought to focus on films rather than comment on issues they supposedly did not understand. The remark landed instantly. A few scattered laughs rippled through the audience, followed by a sudden, heavy silence. It wasn't merely disagreement that people felt, it was discomfort. The comment wasn't framed as debate, it was dismissal, a calculated attempt to reduce Jackson's credibility in front of a room that valued status and authority. All eyes turned toward him. Jackson did not react immediately. He didn't interrupt. He didn't smile. He paused. He adjusted his glasses slowly and let the silence stretch, allowing the weight of her words to settle fully into the space. That pause became a statement in itself. The room grew quieter than it had been all evening. In that stillness, the balance of power subtly shifted. When Jackson finally spoke, his voice remained steady, unraised, deliberate. He spoke about leadership as something proven through action rather than image, about integrity as something tested when it is inconvenient rather than celebrated when it is easy. His words were not defensive. They were foundational, laying the groundwork for a deeper point. The audience listened intently, sensing that this was building towards something they hadn't anticipated. Jackson spoke about the danger of confidence unanchored from accountability, about how authority loses meaning when it is insulated from scrutiny. Then, without raising his voice or changing his posture, he delivered a statement that cut through the room with surgical precision, suggesting that before questioning anyone's integrity, one should be prepared to support their own claims with verifiable facts. The words were calm, but their impact was immediate. Ivanka attempted to recover with a brief laugh, a familiar tactic meant to soften the moment and regain control, but the energy in the room had already changed. Jackson's calm refusal to be diminished transformed what could have been a fleeting jab into the opening of something far larger, a confrontation not fueled by anger, but by accountability. The audience sensed it immediately. This was no longer a polite exchange of opinions. This was the beginning of a reckoning, one that would pull the conversation away from performance and into substance, away from image and toward truth, setting the stage for a moment that would redefine the entire evening and leave everyone present aware that they were witnessing something that could not be undone. The shift in the room after Jackson's measured response was impossible to ignore, as though an invisible line had been crossed and there was no returning to the safety of polite discussion. The audience, once relaxed in their seats, now leaned forward almost instinctively, drawn into the gravity of the moment. Ivanka Trump, still seated in the front row, maintained her composed posture, but the effortless confidence she had carried moments earlier began to feel strained, as if she were suddenly aware that the familiar tools of charm, humor, and dismissal were no longer sufficient. Jackson continued speaking, not rushing, not pressing aggressively, but carefully expanding his point, framing leadership as something that demands consistency between words and actions. He spoke about how authority, when insulated from accountability, becomes hollow, how public trust erodes not through dramatic failures alone but through quiet evasions that accumulate over time. His voice never rose, yet every sentence carried the weight of experience, resonating deeply with an audience accustomed to rehearsed rhetoric. He spoke about the responsibility of those in visible positions to accept scrutiny rather than deflect it, to answer difficult questions rather than diminish the questioner. The room remained silent, attentive, almost reverent. Ivanka listened closely, her expression controlled, but the subtle cues were there, the tightening of her jaw, the slight shift in her shoulders, signals that she recognized the conversation was no longer unfolding on her terms. Jackson's calm presence filled the space, and with each measured sentence, he dismantled the notion that credibility is tied to profession rather than principle. He reminded the audience that history is shaped not by titles but by choices, that courage is often quiet, and that truth rarely needs volume to be heard. As he spoke, journalists scribbled notes more urgently, sensing the significance of what was happening. This was not a spectacle designed for headlines, it was a moment of clarity unfolding in real time. When Jackson finally addressed the heart of the issue directly, he did so without accusation, instead framing it as a question of standards. He spoke about the importance of evidence, about how integrity must be proven when challenged, not protected by status or lineage. His words hovered in the air, heavy and deliberate. Ivanka attempted to respond with composure, offering a brief remark meant to reassert control, but her voice, though steady, lacked the authority it carried earlier. The audience noticed. The dynamic had shifted. Jackson did not interrupt or dismiss her response. Instead, he listened, nodded slightly, and then continued, explaining that leadership requires the willingness to face uncomfortable truths, especially when those truths threaten carefully constructed narratives. He spoke about the millions of people who live with the consequences of decisions made in rooms like this one, people for whom accountability is not theoretical but immediate and unavoidable. The contrast between lived experience and insulated privilege became increasingly clear. The room absorbed the message quietly, collectively. Ivanka's attempts to deflect began to diminish, her remarks shorter, more cautious, as if she were recalibrating in real time. Jackson's calm refusal to engage in personal insult elevated the exchange beyond confrontation, transforming it into a lesson on responsibility. He spoke about how power often shields people from consequences, but never from reality, and how avoiding truth only delays its arrival. The silence that followed each of his statements grew heavier, not awkward, but contemplative. People were no longer watching for drama, they were listening for meaning. Jackson then paused briefly, allowing the room to settle, before delivering a statement that reframed everything that had been said up to that point. Without theatrics, without hostility, he suggested that if integrity is to be questioned publicly, then proof must be welcomed publicly as well. The implication was unmistakable. The room froze. Cameras stopped clicking. Pens hovered midair. Ivanka's expression tightened, and for the first time that evening, she did not immediately respond. That silence spoke volumes. Jackson did not press the moment for reaction. Instead, he continued, emphasizing that accountability is not punishment but responsibility, that transparency is not humiliation but respect for the public. He spoke about how leaders lose credibility not when they are challenged, but when they refuse to engage honestly with those challenges. The audience felt the weight of his words settle deeply, recognizing that this exchange had moved beyond individual personalities and into something far more consequential. Ivanka's silence lingered, and in that silence, the carefully curated balance of the room dissolved. Jackson's calm, unwavering presence had shifted the focus from image to substance, from performance to principle. The audience understood they were witnessing a turning point, not just in the discussion, but in the atmosphere itself. This was no longer a debate to be won or lost. It was a reckoning unfolding quietly, deliberately, and with a clarity that could not be dismissed, setting the stage for an even more profound moment yet to come. By the time the silence finally broke, the room no longer belonged to any single person on stage, but to the tension itself, thick and unavoidable, wrapping around every listener like a held breath that refused to release. Ivanka Trump eventually spoke again, her words carefully chosen, her tone noticeably more restrained than before, signaling a shift from confidence to caution. She framed her response around unity, civility, and the importance of respectful dialogue, attempting to recenter the conversation on broader ideals rather than the specific challenges Jackson had raised. Yet the shift was transparent. The audience sensed that this was not an expansion of her argument, but a retreat from it. Jackson listened without interruption, his expression steady, his posture relaxed, embodying a patience that contrasted sharply with the unease rippling subtly through the crowd. When he responded, he did not dismiss her appeal to unity. Instead, he reframed it, suggesting that true unity cannot exist without honesty, and that civility loses meaning when it is used to avoid accountability. His voice carried no anger, only conviction, and that calm conviction resonated more powerfully than any raised voice could have. He spoke about how history often remembers moments like these not for their volume, but for their clarity, not for who spoke the loudest, but for who spoke most truthfully. As he continued, Jackson broadened the lens of the conversation, connecting the exchange unfolding in that room to a larger pattern seen repeatedly throughout American history, moments when power resisted scrutiny, when image was prioritized over impact, and when the discomfort of truth was met with deflection rather than engagement. The audience followed him willingly, drawn into a narrative that extended far beyond the stage. He spoke about communities affected by policy decisions made without transparency, about families whose lives were altered by choices justified through polished language rather than evidence. These were not abstract examples, they were reminders that leadership has consequences that echo far beyond press conferences and panel discussions. Ivanka's presence on stage now felt symbolic rather than commanding, her earlier attempt to define the boundaries of credibility quietly unraveling as Jackson redefined authority itself. He emphasized that credibility is earned through consistency, through the willingness to stand by one's words when challenged, and through the courage to admit uncertainty when answers are not clear. The room absorbed his words deeply, and the shift in energy became unmistakable. Audience members exchanged glances, some nodding subtly, others sitting motionless, processing the implications. Jackson's refusal to personalize the exchange elevated it into something instructive, almost reflective, inviting everyone present to consider their own relationship with power and truth. When Ivanka attempted once more to interject, her response was brief, almost tentative, as though she recognized that the momentum no longer belonged to her. Jackson acknowledged her words respectfully, then continued, reinforcing the idea that leadership demands humility alongside confidence, and that the strongest leaders are those willing to listen as much as they speak. His calm authority filled the space, not dominating it, but grounding it. He spoke about how accountability is often framed as an attack, when in reality it is an invitation, to clarify, to explain, to prove alignment between values and actions. The audience felt the weight of that reframing. This was not confrontation, it was an insistence on integrity. As Jackson spoke, the atmosphere shifted again, this time toward introspection. People were no longer reacting to personalities, but reflecting on principles. The room felt smaller somehow, more intimate, as though each listener had been pulled into a private reckoning. Ivanka sat quietly now, her posture composed but subdued, her earlier confidence replaced by a careful stillness. Jackson concluded this portion of his remarks by emphasizing that truth does not fear questions, and that transparency is not weakness but strength. His final words in this moment lingered, settling over the audience like a quiet challenge, one that could not be answered with rhetoric alone. The silence that followed was not empty, it was full, heavy with understanding. The audience knew that the conversation had reached a point of no return. Whatever came next would not merely respond to what had been said, it would define how the moment would be remembered, setting the stage for a conclusion that would resonate far beyond the walls of that room. As the final moments of the discussion unfolded, the room carried a stillness that felt earned rather than imposed, as though everyone present understood they had moved through something transformative together. Ivanka Trump remained composed in appearance, but the authority she initially projected had softened into restraint, her role shifting from narrative driver to silent participant. The exchange had taken on a gravity that no amount of careful messaging could undo. Samuel L. Jackson, sensing the weight of the moment, did not press further, nor did he seek a dramatic closing statement. Instead, he grounded his final remarks in reflection, speaking about how moments of accountability are rarely comfortable, yet always necessary. He reminded the audience that progress is born not from agreement, but from the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths with honesty and humility. His words did not target individuals, they challenged systems, habits, and assumptions that allow power to drift away from responsibility. He spoke about how public trust is not inherited, branded, or protected by image, but built slowly through transparency, consistency, and the courage to answer difficult questions. The audience listened without interruption, fully engaged, aware that the conversation had transcended its original purpose. Jackson emphasized that leadership is ultimately measured by how it responds under pressure, not when applause is guaranteed, and that dignity is preserved not by avoiding scrutiny, but by meeting it directly. As he concluded, the room remained silent for a beat longer than expected, not out of shock, but recognition. Applause followed, not explosive or celebratory, but steady and respectful, a collective acknowledgement of the clarity that had been offered. Ivanka rose with the rest of the audience, her expression neutral, thoughtful, offering no rebuttal, no closing defense. In that moment, the contrast spoke louder than words. The evening ended without spectacle, without raised voices, without triumphal declarations, yet its impact lingered far beyond the walls of the venue. Journalists would later describe it as a turning point, not because of confrontation, but because of composure. Commentators would analyze it not for insults exchanged, but for standards established. Viewers watching later would notice what those in the room felt immediately, that this was a rare instance where image yielded to substance, where calm truth proved more powerful than polished dismissal. Jackson exited the stage quietly, without acknowledgement of victory, understanding that moments like these are not about winning, but about clarity. Ivanka departed surrounded by aides, the evening's outcome already reshaping the narrative she had intended to control. The city outside continued its restless rhythm, unaware that inside that hall, something subtle yet profound had shifted. What remained was not scandal, nor spectacle, but a reminder, etched into memory, that accountability does not need aggression, that truth does not require volume, and that sometimes the most decisive moments arrive not with noise, but with unwavering calm. And in that calm, the balance of the room had changed forever. The studio lights burned bright enough to erase the outside world, turning the stage into its own sealed universe where power, perception, and pride collided. Every seat in the audience was filled, yet no one spoke. Even before a word was exchanged, everyone understood that this was not an ordinary broadcast. Two women sat across from each other, separated by only a few feet of polished floor, yet divided by entirely different paths to influence. On one side sat Melania Trump, composed and immaculate, carrying herself with the quiet certainty of someone long accustomed to global attention. Her posture was precise, her movements deliberate, every gesture refined by years under public scrutiny. Across from her sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, sharp-eyed and grounded, radiating a different kind of authority, not inherited, not polished by privilege, but forged through confrontation and resilience. Where Melania's power was restraint, Jasmine's was readiness. The audience felt it immediately. This wasn't a discussion waiting to happen, it was a collision waiting for timing. The studio lights burned bright enough to erase the outside world, turning the stage into its own sealed universe where power, perception, and pride collided. Every seat in the audience was filled, yet no one spoke. Even before a word was exchanged, everyone understood that this was not an ordinary broadcast. Two women sat across from each other, separated by only a few feet of polished floor, yet divided by entirely different paths to influence. On one side sat Melania Trump, composed and immaculate, carrying herself with the quiet certainty of someone long accustomed to global attention. Her posture was precise, her movements deliberate, every gesture refined by years under public scrutiny. Across from her sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, sharp-eyed and grounded, radiating a different kind of authority, not inherited, not polished by privilege, but forged through confrontation and resilience. Where Melania's power was restraint, Jasmine's was readiness. The audience felt it immediately. This wasn't a discussion waiting to happen, it was a collision waiting for timing. At first, the exchange followed the expected rhythm of televised civility. Carefully worded responses, polite nods, controlled smiles. But beneath that surface, tension coiled tightly. It revealed itself in subtle ways, the way Melania's gaze lingered just a moment longer than necessary, the way Jasmine's stillness felt intentional rather than passive. Then the shift came. Melania leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but sharpened by intent. Her remarks began gently, almost diplomatically, before evolving into pointed critiques that questioned Jasmine's principles, her consistency, and the story she told about herself. Each sentence was delivered with elegance, yet carried an unmistakable edge. The comments grew more personal, more dismissive, implying that credibility was earned through status rather than struggle. The room changed. Air thickened. This was no longer debate, it was an attempt to diminish, performed under the glow of studio lights. Jasmine did nothing. She didn't interrupt. She didn't react. She sat in silence so complete it unsettled the room. Seconds passed, 10, 20, 30, and with each one, the audience grew more uncomfortable. Silence became the loudest force on stage. Cameras tightened their focus, searching her face for anger, fear, anything. They found none. Her composure was absolute, her patience surgical. The stillness was no accident, it was strategy. Melania, believing the moment belonged to her, leaned back, satisfied, unaware that the absence of response was creating space for something heavier than any interruption could have carried. By the time Jasmine finally leaned toward the microphone, the entire studio was holding its breath. When she spoke, her voice was calm, almost quiet, yet it landed with undeniable force. She did not shout. She did not accuse. She delivered a single, deliberate statement, not an attack on family, not a rumor, not a claim, but a reflection that cut directly at the illusion of moral superiority. It reframed the entire exchange, exposing the difference between image and integrity, between inherited power and earned credibility. The effect was immediate. The confidence across from her faltered. The audience reacted not with applause, but stunned silence. In that moment, the balance shifted. Jasmine didn't press further. She didn't need to. The message had landed. And as the cameras lingered, it became clear to everyone watching, the confrontation had ended not with noise, but with restraint, and restraint had won. The silence that followed did not fade, it deepened. It settled over the studio like a heavy curtain, pressing against every wall, every breath, every thought. Melania Trump shifted slightly in her chair, the movement small but unmistakable, the kind of adjustment made when certainty slips and instinct takes over. She had entered the stage with an air of command, confident that poise and status would be enough to steer the night. But now the rhythm was gone. The audience could feel it, that subtle but undeniable change when authority loosens its grip. Jasmine Crockett remained still, her hands resting calmly, her gaze steady. She did not look triumphant. She did not look aggressive. She looked resolved. The power of the moment wasn't in what she had said alone, but in what she refused to do afterward. No piling on. No spectacle. Just presence. And presence, in that instant, outweighed performance. Melania attempted to regain footing, her voice returning with measured softness, but something fundamental had shifted. Her words circled back on themselves, elegant yet hollow, as though they were searching for ground that no longer existed. She spoke of respect, of misinterpretation, of the dangers of harsh rhetoric, but the audience sensed the contradiction immediately. What moments earlier had been sharp and dismissive now sounded defensive. The contrast was stark. Every sentence she offered seemed to underline the very imbalance Jasmine had exposed without ever naming it. Cameras caught fleeting expressions, a tightened jaw, a glance toward the moderator, a pause that lingered too long. These were not the signs of dominance. They were the signs of recalibration. Across from her, Jasmine listened, unblinking, allowing the space to do its work. Then, with the room fully attuned, Jasmine leaned forward again. This time, her words were not aimed at her opponent. They were aimed beyond the stage, beyond the studio, toward the millions watching from living rooms, phones, and screens across the country. Her tone softened, but her authority sharpened. She spoke about leadership not as a title, but as responsibility. About integrity not as a slogan, but as a daily choice. She spoke of how power reveals itself not in moments of comfort, but in moments of challenge. And with each sentence, the audience leaned closer, sensing that they were no longer witnessing a clash between two individuals, but a reframing of what the night was truly about. The debate had transformed into something larger, a mirror held up to the culture of public life itself. The moderator attempted to steer the conversation back to safer terrain, but the current was too strong. The room had already chosen its focus. Jasmine's calm command had drawn a line without ever raising her voice. Melania sat quietly now, her earlier certainty replaced by measured restraint. It wasn't humiliation. It was displacement. The spotlight had moved, not through force, but through gravity. As the cameras widened to capture the full stage, the visual told the story better than any commentary could. One woman held the room without demanding it. The other, for the first time that night, simply occupied her seat. And everyone watching understood, this was no longer about who spoke last. It was about who spoke with meaning. By now, the studio no longer felt like a place for conversation. It felt like a courtroom where an unspoken verdict was forming in real time. The audience sat motionless, not because they were instructed to be quiet, but because instinct told them this was a moment that demanded attention. Every cough, every shuffle of a foot felt intrusive against the weight in the air. Melania Trump remained composed on the surface, but the effortless control she had displayed earlier was gone. Her presence was still dignified, still refined, yet no longer commanding. She had become reactive rather than directive, responding to the moment instead of shaping it. Jasmine Crockett, meanwhile, had not moved much at all. That was the most striking part. She did not pace. She did not gesture wildly. She did not lean into theatrics. Her power came from restraint, from the confidence to let silence speak where others would rush to fill it. As the exchange continued, it became clear that Melania's earlier strategy had backfired. What began as a calculated attempt to question credibility had exposed something deeper, a disconnect between polish and substance. Each time Melania tried to reassert herself, the effort felt increasingly deliberate, increasingly forced. The audience could sense it, even if they couldn't articulate it. This wasn't about winning an argument anymore. It was about authenticity versus presentation. And authenticity, once recognized, is difficult to dislodge. Jasmine's earlier words had planted that recognition quietly, almost invisibly, but now it had taken root. The cameras captured nods from audience members, exchanged glances, subtle reactions that spoke volumes. This was not allegiance to a person. It was alignment with a principle. When Jasmine spoke again, she did so with intention, not urgency. She acknowledged the tension without naming it, recognizing that moments like these were uncomfortable precisely because they mattered. Her voice carried a steadiness that suggested she was not speaking for approval, but for clarity. She talked about how public discourse had shifted over time, how sharp attacks had replaced thoughtful disagreement, and how easily power could be misused when accountability was absent. She did not point fingers. She did not revisit insults. Instead, she reframed the night as an example, not of conflict, but of choice. A choice between escalation and elevation. Between dominance and dignity. And in doing so, she reclaimed the narrative entirely. Melania listened, her expression carefully neutral, yet noticeably quieter. She no longer interrupted. She no longer redirected. The room had moved past that phase. The energy now belonged to reflection, not reaction. Even the moderator seemed hesitant to step in, sensing that any interruption would fracture something fragile and rare. As Jasmine concluded her thoughts, she leaned back slightly, signaling completion rather than victory. There was no dramatic flourish, no final blow. Just resolution. The kind that settles slowly, unmistakably, leaving behind a clarity that cannot be undone. And in that stillness, the audience understood something profound: the most powerful moments are not always loud. Sometimes, they arrive calmly, sit quietly, and change everything without asking permission. The closing moments of the broadcast carried a weight that lingered far beyond the studio walls. No one rushed to speak. No one rushed to move. It was as if the room itself understood that something rare had taken place, not a viral clash, not a headline-hunting argument, but a shift in tone that could not be easily undone. Melania Trump remained seated, composed yet subdued, her earlier certainty now replaced with a careful stillness. She was no longer the axis around which the conversation turned. Across from her, Jasmine Crockett sat with quiet assurance, not triumphant, not celebratory, but grounded. The audience sensed it instinctively: the moment had passed its peak, and what remained was its meaning. When Jasmine leaned toward the microphone one final time, it was not to revisit conflict, but to close the door it had opened. Her voice was steady, reflective, carrying the calm authority of someone who understood the responsibility of being heard. She spoke about the kind of leadership that endures, leadership rooted in accountability rather than image, in service rather than status. She reminded viewers that power reveals itself most clearly when restraint is chosen over retaliation, when dignity is upheld even under pressure. Her words were not directed at her counterpart, nor were they framed as a rebuttal. They were an invitation. An invitation to expect more from public discourse, more from those who hold influence, and more from ourselves as a nation watching it all unfold. The audience responded not with explosive applause, but with something far more telling. A slow, deliberate acknowledgement. Heads nodded. Hands came together steadily, not out of excitement, but out of recognition. The kind of applause that says, "This mattered." Melania did not interrupt. She did not counter. She simply listened. And in that listening, the transformation of the night was complete. The confrontation that had once threatened to descend into spectacle had instead become a moment of collective reflection. The cameras pulled back, capturing the full stage, 2 figures, 1 moment, and a room forever altered by how it unfolded. As the moderator thanked both participants and the broadcast moved toward its close, the lasting impression was unmistakable. Titles had not won the night. Volume had not won the night. What prevailed was composure, timing, and the courage to elevate when provoked. Long after the lights dimmed and the audience filed out, the moment continued to echo, not because of what was said in anger, but because of what was offered in calm. Viewers at home would remember it not as a clash, but as a turning point. A reminder that true strength does not announce itself loudly. It reveals itself quietly, decisively, and leaves behind a silence filled with understanding.